Welcome to Designs for Sharpening Leadership. Today, we're going to look at the Patriarchal Era. The Patriarchal Era is a time in the Old Testament, Patriarchal Era is a time in the Old Testament when the ancient fathers lived. People like Adam and Eve and Noah and Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. And what we're going to try to do is focus in on those people and bring them up to where we are so that you can examine their lives and be familiar with them. This lesson is simply about developing familiarity with the patriarchs. Now, we're going to start in the book of Genesis today. And Genesis, of course, is the first book of the Old Testament. It is called the book of Genesis because it is the book of beginnings. It's written in the Hebrew language. Now, during this time, there was a man by the name of Job, and we don't read about Job in the book of Genesis whatsoever. Job is mentioned in his own book, in a book later on in the poetry section. Job was one of the first books written of the Old Testament, and we know this because of the type of Hebrew language that was used, the endings of the words, the styles of the words that were used, the phraseologies. These were all indicators that Job was one of the earliest writings of the Old Testament. So Job probably lived during the time of the patriarchs or during the time of Genesis. We want to begin with two people that everyone is very familiar with, and that is Adam and Eve. And we read about Adam and Eve in Genesis chapters 1 through 4. Adam and Eve intrigue us because they are the first people that God created. Everyone else from there was a result of natural causes. Adam and Eve have children, and they have children, and they have children, and here we all are today. Adam and Eve were created on the sixth day of creation. Genesis 1 talks about 7 literal days, 24-hour days, periods of creation. And on the sixth day, Adam and Eve were created. According to Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, God said, "Let us make man in our own image." And he was talking about mankind there. Over in Genesis chapter 2, he's going to specifically create Eve, but he is going to talk about mankind in general. Now, Adam and Eve lived in the Garden of Eden. We're all aware of that. Adam and Eve sinned. They disobeyed God. And because of that sin, God had to remove them from the garden. When they left the garden, they began to have children. And the two children that we are most familiar with are a couple of guys by the name of Cain and Abel. And we read about Cain and Abel in Genesis chapter 4. Cain and Abel both brought sacrifices to God. Hebrews chapter 11 tells us why Cain's sacrifice was not accepted and why Abel's sacrifice was accepted. Abel's sacrifice was accepted because it was offered in faith. Cain's was not. We're not told about the nature of that faith. We're not told about whether it was fruit or vegetables or meat, although Abel did bring a meat sacrifice. The only thing that we know is that Cain did not offer his sacrifice in faith. And because Cain was jealous of Abel, he rose up one day and killed Abel. And then when God came looking for Abel, Cain said, "What? Am I my brother's keeper?" And God said, "Of course you're your brother's keeper. We are accountable for our actions, and we're accountable how those actions affect other people's lives." When we think about the patriarchs of the book of Genesis, we also come across a man by the name of Noah. Noah, and most everyone is familiar with Noah. Noah chapter 6 through 9, and this is the great patriarch of the worldwide flood. God looks at mankind because of their sinfulness. He regrets in his heart that he made man. He wants to cleanse the earth of man and start all over, but he finds Noah. And the scripture says in Genesis chapter 6 that Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, or Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And so Noah then becomes a preacher of righteousness. Noah and his 3 sons build the ark, and in the ark, 8 souls are saved, the scripture says. And God begins again with Noah and blesses the earth through Noah. But these are just the preliminary patriarchs. Eventually, God is going to begin to work through another important character, and that character's name is Abraham. And Abraham's wife was known as Sarah. But before they were known as Abraham and Sarah, they were known as Abram and Sarai. Interesting. In that culture, your name represented who you were. And so Abraham had an original name of Abraham, or actually his original name was Abram, and then God would change that. His original name, Abram, meant exalted father, and then God changed that name to mean a father of a multitude. Abraham means a father of a multitude. Sarai's original name meant noble lady, but when God changed it to Sarah, then her name meant princess. And so we see God starting with this couple, and what he's going to do now in Genesis chapter 12 through Genesis chapter 25 is begin to develop the line of people that will bring about the nation of Israel, and eventually this nation will bring about Christ. And so we have Abraham, who is the father of a multitude. Abraham, who is the father of a multitude. Abraham becomes the father of the Jews. Abraham becomes the father of the Arabs. And Abraham becomes the father of the Christians. In Galatians chapter 3, verse 29, we're told that Abraham is the father of the faithful. And if we as Christians live faithfully, then we are of Abraham's seed. We are his descendants. Now, in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, God will call Abraham out of the Ur of Chaldees, out of the ancient city of Ur, and he's going to promise him that he will make him the father of many nations, and that he will bless the world through him, and that he will curse those that curse him. And that is exactly what Abraham does. The only problem is that Abraham did not have any children. It was quite a long time before Abraham would have any children. In Genesis chapter 17, God establishes his covenant with Abraham. So we're going to look at the word covenant, and we'll explore this idea of covenant further in another lesson. But God establishes his covenant with Abraham, and Abraham and all of the males of Abraham's family are a part of the covenant. They're distinguished by the act of circumcision. And so when Abraham comes out of the Ur of Chaldees, he brings some people along with him. Of course, he brings his wife Sarai, but the scripture says he also brings his nephew with him, and his nephew's name is Lot. And we read about Lot. Lot was a very prosperous uh, rancher, farmer, shepherd, and Lot built his home next to Abraham, but the land could not sustain both of them. So Abraham said, "If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. Let's divide and live happily together in the land." And so Lot did that. Lot went down to the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and there he lived. Now, the interesting thing about Lot is that he always finds himself in danger. Uh, Abraham has to rescue Lot one time when the 2 cities are uh, are overtaken by a hostile group of kings, and then God has to rescue Lot when God decides to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah for their pride, for their immorality, for their rotten way of living. And God will take Lot out of the city. Lot eventually becomes the father of two groups of people. And I mention these two groups of people because you will need to know these later on as you study the Old Testament. First of all, there are the Moabites, and then there are the Ammonites. And so God has these two people groups now that he's working with as a result of Lot. Well, as I told you before, Abraham and Sarah were not able to have children for quite a long time. And so Sarah, wanting to give her husband children, takes her handmaid, Hagar, and gives Hagar to Abraham and says, "Go into Hagar, my handmaid, and produce children for me. And when she has this child, then I will claim the child for my own, and then I will give the child to you." So Abraham goes into Hagar, and as a result of that relationship, there is a son that is born, and that son's name is Ish. Let's see, we just misspelled it there. That son's name is Ishmael. Ishmael. And from Ishmael, we have a number of the tribes of the Arab people that eventually come to populate the earth. And so now there's a problem because Ishmael is not the son of promise. And eventually, God will bless Sarah, and Sarah will bring forth a son for Abraham, whose name is Isaac. And as we've talked about before, names have meanings. Isaac's name meant one of laughter. And of course, Sarah was joyful that she was able to please her husband in giving him a son. Eventually, what will happen is that Abraham will drive Ishmael away from Isaac so that Isaac can then become the son of promise because God is preparing a kingdom. God is preparing a people so that he can bring forth the Christ and restore people to a right relationship with himself. We want to go on and talk a little bit about Isaac. Eventually, Sarah will die, and Isaac has a very close relationship with his mother. Eventually, Abraham has to send his servant back to Sarah's brother to find a wife for Isaac. And Isaac meets. Actually, this was an arranged marriage. We probably wouldn't like that today here, wherever we live. But a servant will bring back to Isaac his intended wife. The servant will bring back for Isaac a wife. This was an arranged marriage, and that wife's name is Rebekah. Rebekah. And Rebekah comes back, and she becomes the wife of Isaac. We read about this in Genesis chapter 21 through 27. And they produce two sons. They produce two sons by the name of Jacob. Here we go, and Esau. Jacob and Esau. And these are twins. Esau is the firstborn. Jacob is the one that comes second. And as Jacob is being born, he's holding on to Esau's heel. And so he is known as the supplanter. Remember, names have important meanings. Jacob's name meant the one who holds on or overcomes the supplanter. Esau's name meant the red one because his skin was rather red when he was born. Esau eventually became the father of the Edomite people. And now God has another people group to work with. And so Jacob and Esau are brothers. There's always this rivalry. And Jacob ends up doing two things to Esau. First of all, Jacob cheats Esau out of his birthright. And really, Esau was the one who cheated himself, I believe, because he let his stomach overcome his better senses. He was hungry and actually sold his birthright to Jacob. And then eventually, Jacob will steal the blessing that the father would give to the firstborn, in which the firstborn got twice as much as anybody else. And so Jacob will take the birthright and will take the blessing and leave Esau with nothing. But eventually, Esau will become very prosperous himself. And so, what we want to do now is talk for a bit about this idea of Jacob. Jacob. Hello, Jacob. There we go. Jacob. And Jacob is recorded for us actually in Genesis chapter 25 through 50. His name means one who is a supplanter, someone who overcomes. He's a clever, ambitious rascal, if you will. Eventually, God will change his name after Jacob wrestles with God to the name of Israel. And Israel means prince with God. Prince with God. He is a prince with God. So that is Jacob. So we read about this in Genesis chapter 32:28, where Jacob's name is changed. Jacob is on his way to meet Laban, his grandmother's brother, and he's hoping to find some refuge there because he's running away from Esau, who hates him. And when he gets to Laban's home, he sees that Laban has some daughters. In particular, Laban has a daughter, Rachel, whom Jacob falls madly in love with. And so he agrees to serve Laban for 7 years in order to get to marry Rachel. So on the wedding night, Laban does a little switcheroo, if you will. He becomes the supplanter, the clever individual, the rascal, the scoundrel, and he changes the daughters. He gives, instead of Rachel, he gives Leah. Of course, Jacob's really upset about this. The next morning, wakes up, finds out he had the wrong woman, and he confronts Laban and agrees to serve Laban another 7 years in order to get Rachel. Now, here's the interesting aspect of this thing, is that with Leah comes her handmaid, Zilpah, and with Rachel comes her handmaid, Bilhah. Now, I mention this because all four of these women will play a very significant role in the development of the nation of Israel, the nation that God will use to bring about the Christ child, the nation that God will use to bring about redemption for all of mankind. And what we have here is Jacob giving birth to 12 sons. 12 sons, and they're going to produce one daughter. Leah, the first wife, starts giving children immediately to Jacob. She gives him Reuben, and then Simeon, then Levi, then Judah, and then finally a girl who is Dinah. Now, of course, Rachel's very upset because she wants children, but she doesn't have children, and so she says, listen, here's my handmaid, Bilhah. If you will go into her and have children with her, then I will have children through Bilhah. And Bilhah gives to Jacob two sons, Dan and Naphtali. Naphtali. And Leah has stopped bearing children, and so she is jealous, and so she says, well, if you can give Bilhah, then I can give Zilpah. And Zilpah begins to give Jacob children, and she gives him Gad, and Asher. And then Leah will give Jacob two more children, and she will give him Issachar and Zebulun. And then finally, Rachel will give Jacob some children. Rachel will give two children. She will give Joseph and she will give Benjamin. Benjamin. When Benjamin is born, Rachel will die of childbirth complications. Joseph is the favored child of Jacob because, after all, Joseph was the first child of Rachel, who was the one that Jacob fell in love with at the very beginning. Now, there's some important things that you need to know about these brothers here, just very quickly, because this figures in to God preparing the nation of Israel to bring forth the Christ. God is always bringing back people to himself through Jesus Christ, and God is making the preparations here. In this case, we have some brothers that really lost their inheritance because of stupid things that they did, sinful things that they did, if you will. Reuben, for instance, committed incest. We're going to circle his name. That's not a very good circle there. Reuben committed incest by having a sexual relationship with Bilhah, who was the handmaid of Rachel, but legally became the wife of his father Jacob. And so he's cut out. And then Simeon and Levi are cut out of their inheritance as far as being the firstborn because they massacred the Shechemites in the land of Canaan. And then Judah, who is actually the fourth son born, will become the one that inherits the right to rule the nation. He becomes the leading son. Now, all of these men uh, lost their position as the birthright, except for Judah, and Judah will, of course, become the one that brings forth the birth of Christ in the nation of Israel. So let's go back up here and let's look at something else here. We want to focus in on one more of the children of Israel, and that is Joseph. Remember, I said that Joseph was the favored son of Jacob. In fact, Joseph had some interesting dreams. He dreamed that his mother and father and all of his brothers would eventually bow down to him. In fact, he had two dreams about that. And his brothers hated him because of that, but they also hated him because Jacob gave to Joseph a coat of many colors, made an example of him, gave him extra gifts. So they hated him. So one day they found him wandering in the field, threw him into a pit, and as the Midianites came by, sold him to the Midianites, who then took him to Egypt. They sold him, the Midianites sold him as a slave to a man that some of us are familiar with, a man by the name of Potiphar. And Potiphar took Joseph and put him in charge as being the chief steward in his house. So everything in Potiphar's house was in charge by Joseph, except one thing, and that was Potiphar's wife. And Potiphar's wife had an evil eye. She looked at Joseph and said, "Listen, let's sleep together. Let's enjoy one another. You're handsome. You're good looking." And Joseph said, "How can I do this and sin against God?" You see where Joseph's priorities were? His relationship with God first. It wasn't so much Potiphar that he was concerned about, but he wanted to have a right relationship with his God. And one day, Potiphar's wife caught Joseph off guard. Nobody was in the house. She said, "Come and lie with me, and we'll have a good time." And Joseph said, "I can't do this." So he ran from the house, but as he was running from the house, Potiphar's wife grabbed his coat, ripped it off of him, and left him without a coat. Of course, she took this opportunity. She took the coat of Joseph to her husband Potiphar when he came home that night and said, "See this Hebrew slave you brought into me? He has tried to come in and make sport of me." And of course, Potiphar was upset with Joseph and eventually had him thrown into the king's jail. And so while he's in jail, we'll find Joseph becoming the leader in the jail. The guards in the jail put Joseph in charge of everything. Isn't that interesting? He begins to interpret dreams for the baker and for the butler of Pharaoh. And when the butler gets out, he is restored. When the baker gets out, his head is chopped off. And eventually, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, will have some dreams, and he doesn't know how to interpret these dreams. He calls all of his wise men. We're going to go back and erase Pharaoh here. Eventually, Pharaoh will have some dreams, and he will call all of his wise men in, and they can't interpret his dreams. But his butler says, "You know, I remember being in jail, and there was this guy by the name of Joseph. He interpreted my dream. I think that he could help you with this problem." And so Joseph was brought out. He interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said, "Where can I find such a wise man to help us? Because the dream said that you'll have 7 years of good crops and then 7 years of famine." And so he thought to himself, "Joseph, you interpreted the dream. You're the man for the job." And Joseph begins to now sit at the right hand of Pharaoh. He's gone from a slave to prisoner to the right hand of Pharaoh. While Joseph is in Egypt, leading the nation of Egypt, two sons are born to Joseph, and they are Ephraim and Manasseh. Ephraim and Manasseh. Now, here's what's interesting. Here's the interesting thing that happens here. Jacob and his brothers are still, or his sons are still back up in the land of Canaan, and the famine has extended there. And so Jacob says to his sons, "Go down to Egypt and get us some food." When they come to Egypt, they meet Joseph, but they don't recognize Joseph, but Joseph recognizes them. Joseph uses this opportunity to restore the family, and God will use this opportunity to bring Jacob and his family down to Egypt, and so that is exactly what happens. Joseph will eventually die in Egypt. The other sons of Jacob will die in Egypt. Jacob will die in Egypt, and they'll bury him back in the land of Canaan. But right now, the patriarchal period has now come to a close. Now we've finished with the patriarchal era and all of the people involved: Adam and Eve, Noah, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Esau, and then Jacob and Leah, and Jacob and Rachel, and then the 12 sons of Jacob. And the man that will lead off the next section, of course, is Moses. Now, I want to leave you with one passage of Scripture that I want you to consider this week as you are moving along in your walk with the Lord, and that is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 11. And there the passage of Scripture says, "Now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come." These things happened to us as examples. These are the men, these are the women that went along in the very beginning that God was using to prepare his kingdom, that God was using to bring people back to himself through Jesus Christ. God was using these people, and they were willing to be used by God. They walked faithfully with God, and they lived their lives as examples to us. God showed us the good side, and God showed us the bad side. God did not hide their sins from us. God openly demonstrated what their lives were like, but God openly demonstrated to us his grace and his mercy.